TellyCast, the TV industry news review.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby and welcome to TellyCast. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth II last week, broadcasters both in the UK and around the world have been following developments in minute detail, switching to pre-planned emergency schedules and particularly in the case of public service broadcasters, keeping the nation and the wider world informed of ongoing developments. On this week's show, I'm joined by Chris Curtis, Editor-in-Chief of Broadcast Magazine, to chat through how the UK TV industry has reacted and how the networks have covered these unprecedented events. Chris, welcome back to TellyCast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Justin. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Lovely to have you back on the show. And I'm reminded when I was going through our back catalogue, you were on the very first telecast. It's lovely to have you back in these quite strange times. And as I said earlier on, unprecedented, isn't it? Everything that's going on in the UK industry right now.
Yeah, it's a very slightly disconcerting, slightly weird, slightly unusual kind of feeling in London and across the UK at the moment. Primarily because of the longevity of the Queen and the length of her reign and the fact that for the vast majority of people who are alive, they've never known another monarch. And so that sort of sense of continuity has been broken. And so society, and indeed, as we'll talk about, the broadcast sector, the PSBs and the wider TV industry have had to react to something that they haven't done previously in living memory.
As I was in the back of a cab, in the back of a London taxi the other day, I was having a chat with the cabbie, and it occurred to me that whereas myself, as you say, I've only known one monarch, but my kids will more than likely know three. Mm. So that sort of continuity and that, that change, we've never seen it before. And actually now, second Elizabethan age is over. And now we're entering into uncharted territory, really. So for everybody outside the UK who probably discovered the news in a slightly different way than we did in the UK, but obviously everybody did through the medium of TV. But can you just give us an insight on how the TV networks broke the news of the Queen's death last week?
I guess I would slightly take issue with the notion that the TV industry broke the news. The TV industry moved very quickly. And on the day of the Queen's death, we went very quickly from there being unusual statements issued around the concerns around the Queen's health. And then later on in the day, it was around 6:30 in the evening that the palace formally announced her death. I suspect a lot of people received the news via the internet, via news apps, so I suspect it was often the broadcasters, now whether that's BBC or ITV or Sky News, but phones were pinging and emails were received. But it's interesting that very quickly, what do people do in the event of unprecedented circumstances? They turn on the telly still. And there was undoubtedly a surge to all the news websites, but people reach for the remote control and they kind of want to put the telly on. And there is something reassuring, I think, about that for the industry and sort of reassuring for the British society as a whole. But very quickly, people turned on the public service broadcasters. They largely turned to the BBC, as tends to happen in these sort of moments of national significance. But obviously, it turned to ITV and the other commercial PSBs as well. And around 16 million people were watching telly around sort of 6:45 on the day that the Queen's death was announced. So a huge proportion of the British population's first thought almost was turn on the television. And that does speak to the importance of and the ongoing significance of a linear television, something that's happening now and live. I mean, people weren't turning to streamers for this. They were turning to British traditional PSB broadcasters. The role that those organisations play in our society, something seismic happens and you turn on the telly to see what the BBC and indeed ITV, Channel 4 and the others are saying about it. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and they have the ability, the unique ability, I would say, to capture the mood of the event and also portray the right sort of tone or hit the right sort of tone, because it's almost comfort, isn't it? I think that people can get the news from Twitter, or they can go onto any sort of news organization's website, but actually to tune into the BBC, I think, in particular, and just to understand, the gravity of the situation. It's almost like a comfort, I think, that people are going there for.
And the other interesting thing about this story is, from a content point of view, it is both immensely, it's kind of difficult to overstate the significance of it from a cultural point of view, but also it's not a story that's a fast-paced story in a way that some major events are a fast-paced story. So the reality is that around tea time, the announcement is made from the palace that the Queen has died. And there isn't a huge amount more information that emerges over the coming minutes and hours. And so to a certain extent, it's not a rolling news story in the sense of a television broadcaster needing to bring you the very latest update of the very, the next piece of information to emerge, because not that much information emerged that quickly afterwards. So it then becomes an exercise in marking the occasion, in explaining the significance, in recapping the Queen's reign, the Queen's life, etc. And that's where the broadcasters, the PSBs, they were ready for this. They were absolutely prepped. It's impossible to overstate the importance. They knew how important it was to get it right. But it still becomes an exercise, really, in filling the airwaves with important, tonally appropriate content when the actual events themselves aren't unfolding at a dramatic pace. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, as you say, this is obviously been rehearsed for a long time. And they've had that opportunity, and I'm talking specifically about BBC, to get this right and to bring into context, I think, her life, not only for, viewers, maybe traditional BBC One viewers who are perhaps more in their 60s, but also, the wider society and people of all ages. So I think that's the tonal balance and the significance of bringing the events to people in the right way. It's such a broad audience has been, I think, up to this point, my view is it's been pretty well delivered.
Yep.
It was Hugh Edwards, the BBC anchor, who interrupted the shows with a short statement, and we'll put a link to that in the episode description. So if you didn't see it, you can click through and have a look. Do you think they've got it right up to this point?
I believe so. I guess what I would say is, it's so difficult. It's so hard. We shouldn't shy away from the fact that British society has a wide spectrum of views about the monarchy as an institution, right? And that there are people who never met the Queen, who are besides themselves with grief, and have been since the news of her death passed. And there are also people for whom this news, it feels like, whilst I think everyone would probably acknowledge the significance of it, on an emotional level, it might leave them absolutely cold, and it might feel like there has no emotional resonance with them as individuals. So the BBC, finds itself in a situation where it needs to reflect what it believes is the sort of consensus position within British society, but knowing that it's never going to please everybody, which is sort of the BBC's default position on almost everything that it does. I think solemnity would be a word that springs to mind in terms of how what's been important with the coverage. They've tried to make the coverage solemn. They've tried to make the coverage authoritative. They've tried to make it comprehensive. There really has been no stone left unturned in all of this. They had lots of documentaries ready to go in terms of whether that was talking heads and tributes, whether that was looking at different elements of the Queen's life, the Queen's reign, significant moments on a personal level, family incidents, things that have happened during that time period. Because of the duration of her reign, the number of world leaders that she met is sort of phenomenal. Number of popes, the number of different dignitaries, heads of state from across the world, number of US presidents. Some of those meetings very successful, some of those meetings slightly more controversial. So, there's a lot to say historically one of the things that that occurs is there hasn't been as much to say. Like I said before, it's not a fast moving story, but we have had now, some things have happened. The Queen's body has moved and has begun the journey down to London, where the Queen will lie in state, and people will be able to come and pay their respects. And we've had the proclamation of the new king broadcast for the first time. And King Charles, it seems strange saying it, King Charles III gave his televised speech. Again, I think 13 million people, British people, watched that live on television. And of course, we're recording this ahead of the funeral on Monday the 19th. And I think that it's a bank holiday in the UK. I mean, I'm conscious that some of your listeners are not based in the UK, Justin, but the country will effectively close down on Monday the 19th. It's not like a normal bank holiday where people go to garden centres or go shopping or do whatever it is they want to do. It's going to be a quiet, probably quite a somber day, and who knows what the ratings, the TV rating, the viewing figures will be for the funeral itself. But I would imagine they're going to be absolutely vast across all the PSBs. And in some ways, that will be arguably the most important televisual moment, I would say, in all of this. And it will also potentially mark a moment of closure as well. So at the moment, the broadcasters are grappling with the extent to which they should edge back towards normal schedules. ITV played its entertainment schedule this Saturday evening. It played Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and The Voice and shows like that. And there is a strong argument, I would say, that actually one of the things that British society needs is some escape and some release, and you get some of that from different types of programming. But at the moment, still, the schedules are not, inverted commas, normal, and there's going to be changes and tweaks to the schedules all the way through until Monday the 19th, really. And I suspect after the country has come together, many, many millions of people, like I say, with different emotional responses to this story, but many, many, many millions of people watched the funeral. And I do think that will be a moment where the country and the TV industry moves on, and we sort of move back towards more conventional broadcasting from that point onwards.
Yeah. Before we spoke, I was watching BBC's coverage online, and that has been pretty much 24-hour. There's been quite a few different moves. I mean, the new king has obviously been flown up to Balmoral. Then he came back down to London to accede the throne. And as you say, that was the first time that's ever been broadcast. So that was fascinating from just a historical and heraldic kind of a piece of television. It wasn't a particularly ornate ceremony. It's something that we've never ever seen before. King Charles went back up to Edinburgh to be with the late Queen as she was lying in state. Now he's flown off to Northern Ireland, and he's also going to be visiting Wales as well. So really significant, I think, that we're also seeing the way that the king is acceding to the throne during this period is obviously reaching out to all parts of the UK. And obviously in time as well, particularly around the funeral, but also as the Queen is head of state for many countries around the world, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, many others, and the Commonwealth nations as well is hugely significant. We're not going to be talking about constitution. We're not going to be talking about the king, what that means. But it's interesting to see how this is being choreographed. Yep. And there's a lot going on up until probably Thursday this week when the show comes out. And then the Queen, as you say, will lay in state for 4 days. So we might start to see the schedule coming back to something somewhere near normal. But then, as you say, Monday is going to be probably the most extraordinary days, the most extraordinary televisual event we've seen for a generation.
And I think it's, you can't overstate how important this is for public service broadcasting in the UK. All of these unprecedented events that are going on, they're happening for Joe Public, they're happening through the prism of telly. And if one of the key tenets of the BBC and the commercial PSBs, but especially the BBC, is to unite the country, is to pull the country together. And I don't necessarily mean necessarily in a shared response. So it's not I don't think it's about groupthink or trying to necessarily come onto this potentially manipulate how people are thinking or feeling, but there is a sense of the significance of the events is so great, and people are experiencing those events through the prism of public service broadcasting. And actually, we've had huge events, haven't we, in recent years? It seems perverse to say it. COVID was really important for and positive for public service broadcasters. The war in Ukraine, positive for and important for public service broadcasters. And what does the BBC say to the nation about these things? And now the death of the Queen, it sort of reinforces the sense of public service broadcasting at the heart of British society. We've had a change of prime minister as well. It's sort of being slightly overshadowed. We have no real sense at the moment in terms of the business of government hasn't yet kicked back in, and it soon will have to because of the pressing cost of living crisis and all the other factors that the government needs to grapple with. But down the line, we will return to a debate about the future of public service broadcasting in this country, about whether Channel 4 should be privatised or not, about whether the BBC should be funded by a licence fee or an alternative funding model, and what the implications of an alternative funding model might be for the size and shape of the BBC. And all these debates were live debates a few days ago, right? And they've slightly been put on hold. But when we come out of the other side of the coverage of the Queen's death, her lying in state, the ascension of the new king, the funeral, those debates will kick off again. And at the moment, I would say, if you're the BBC, you would be able to say that you've played your hand pretty well in terms of reaffirming your role in British society. I read a good. I normally don't loath to credit some of my rivals, but The Guardian did a really interesting piece. When Prince Philip died, there were 100,000 complaints to the BBC about the coverage. And largely, those complaints were based around what people perceived to be, for want of a better word, overkill. There was too much of it. It was too, it kind of felt excessive. And according to this Guardian article, there have been 670 complaints about the coverage of the Queen's death compared to 100,000 for the death of Prince Philip, which potentially tells you something about the, not necessarily about the job the BBC has done, but about British society and the way it feels about this. And it's almost kind of, for the average person in the street, I think it's, the BBC couldn't do too much covering the Queen's death because it just feels so seismic and so historically significant. And so if you've got a situation where if the majority of the public feel like the BBC's done a good job in terms of covering something so important, and if the BBC can point to its role in sort of the fabric of British society, then when those debates return about the future of PSB, then potentially the events of the last few years and the events now in terms of the Queen's death could be important in shaping how those debates play out.
Yeah, and to put this into context, and it does seem, I'm trying to think back, as you rightly said, within the last week we've had a change of prime minister, we've had a huge, unprecedented stimulus package agreed, and indeed the last official duty of the Queen was to swear in the new prime minister, which all of that has happened within the last 7 days. So it's extraordinary to even try and think back before then. But the BBC obviously has come in its time, some real criticism for its approach to reporting around the royal family, and perhaps most notably the Panorama interview with Princess Diana that was found to have been obtained by the journalist Martin Bashir by manipulation and forged documents. And also, obviously, Emily Maitlis's Newsnight interview with Prince Andrew, which has, really led to, him stepping back from royal life. So it needed to get this right, and it needs to get this right when it comes over the next few days, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, this is a hot potato topic like no other, right? And there will undoubtedly be lots of people who feel that there's been too much deference, let's say, in terms of the debate about the future of the monarchy. And the BBC does have a duty to reflect the various views that exist within Britain. The balancing act is the timing, right? And we are still so close to the Queen's death. And could and should the BBC play an important role as a forum for debate about the future of the monarchy? Yes, absolutely. Is the time for that debate in the days immediately following the death of Britain's longest serving monarch? Probably not, right? And I think that you could easily fall foul of mainstream public opinion if it was too provocative. And look, some people will criticize it, I'm sure, for being cautious, conservative with a small c, potentially sort of deferential. But these are the editorial judgment calls that particularly sort of news and current affairs divisions at the BBC and the DG need to take. And it doesn't feel yet as though the BBC has dropped the ball on this. And you know what? Sometimes that's what success is. Success is not failing. Success is not landing in hot water. And there has obviously over the years, the BBC's relationship with the government has had its ups and downs. The BBC's relationship with the royal family has had its ups and downs. Certainly, you know, the Prince Andrew interview still feels very recent and very close to the bone. But I think largely speaking, the BBC received plaudits for that interview and how it panned out. But yeah, it's important, unbelievably important for the BBC to get this right, or perhaps, like I was saying, not get it wrong. And I think they've balanced on that tightrope pretty well thus far, I'd say.
Yeah. I can't help wondering what's happened to the two staffers in the background. I don't know if you saw that, Chris, but there was two staffers in the newsroom taking selfies when the announcement was actually being made, and they were on camera. There has been some news coverage on it.
Look, the Beeb needs to be super careful, like I say, unbelievably careful, because you don't want to fall on the wrong side of this topic. But I think they've managed it pretty well. Hugh Edwards is a pretty consummate broadcaster, right? You look at the guy and it's super impressive for extended periods to be both very natural and very, like I said before, solemn on camera. Has done a pretty impressive job. He's been the figurehead for much of this coverage. He led, I'm sure, the coverage of Prince Philip's funeral. We'll have to see how that pans out in terms of Queen's funeral on Monday across the BBC and across ITV and the other PSBs in terms of the talent that they use and the tone and the coverage. And there's also technical challenges around the Queen's funeral, right? This is ITV put out a statement today, and we're just trying to sort of investigate a little bit, trying to get a bit more context. But you know, there was a sentence in the statement from ITV saying this is going to be the largest ever outside broadcast that it has undertaken, and you can understand that. And so huge technical challenges as well as content and editorial tonal challenges in terms of what's coming up on the 19th.
Yeah, absolutely. And technology, you would imagine, will play a really big part of that. You would imagine there's going to be quite a big military involvement in this. And obviously, we're going to see huge amounts of pageantry, world leaders coming together.
And vast numbers of people, right, out on the streets of London. Like, you would suspect there would be potentially many hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people on the streets of central London. And sort of trying to capture the scale of that will be an important part of what the PSBs need to do. Yeah.
I'm sure that's something that you're going to be reporting in broadcast, right? The technical challenges around that.
Definitely. I mean, I think that, you know, how has the British TV industry reacted to the Queen's death? Well, to a certain extent, some elements of the British TV industry have slightly wound down operations, right? Because not that people aren't working, but, you know, the number of press releases that we received in recent days has dried up because people don't want to be cheerfully announcing the fact that they've won a 4-part commission from BBC Two for a documentary series about dogs. You know, there's an element to which business is ongoing, but announcements and stuff are kind of being held back. And, you know, in corporate life in London and the UK, it's in this slightly weird kind of, you know, I'm still working, my colleagues are all still working, we're getting on with stuff. But there are certain things which you can kind of be seen to be doing and certain other things that you know, you wouldn't want to make a whole lot of people redundant at the moment as a company. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to take that. If that decision is the decision you to take as a business, you will still take it. But I suspect you'll take it in 2 weeks' time from now. So there's all this very strange sort of holding pattern in British corporate life and to a certain extent, you know, British society at the moment. Again, it seems slightly banal to talk about it, but screenings of forthcoming TV shows have been cancelled. Fremantle have got a big Boris Johnson drama about, you know, how the response to COVID, and you know, it's Kenneth Branagh as Boris Johnson. I don't quite know what the launch date for that is, but the press screening was supposed to be this week, and they've cancelled it. And Channel 4's cancelled the screening, quite for all the understandable reasons. But everything's in this weird holding pattern, like I say.
Yeah, no, that's right. I've certainly noticed, a huge drop in the number of emails coming into my inbox, and I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you how it was affecting the broadcast office. Just coming back to the BBC and the license fee debate, which is, as you say, was a hot topic, and also the privatisation of Channel 4. We talked on last week's show about Nadine Dorries, who was the former culture secretary who resigned as the new leader. Liz Truss was coming in to take up the role as a prime minister. Now, Nadine Dorries seemed hell-bent, I think, and was seen widely in the industry as somebody who was going to privatise Channel 4 no matter what. And obviously, broadcast has been very vocal in its support of retaining Channel 4 in public hands.
Yep.
What do we know about the new culture secretary, Michelle Donnellan, and her views? And any sort of clues on that? Is she going to be quite as strident, you think, in her approach?
The honest answer, what do we know for certain, is not much. So she was appointed, and my industrious, hardworking, smart team immediately were checking Hansard, which is the sort of record of every word spoken in British Parliament. So has Michelle Donnellan ever uttered the words Channel 4 in British Parliament before? No, she hasn't. So we don't know a huge amount about what she thinks about C4 as an organisation. She has been critical of the licence fee as a funding mechanism previously. So I think it's not fair to characterise her as a sort of opponent or a critic of the BBC. There's no evidence that she, thinks the BBC is unfair or, unbalanced or whatever, but she's raised concerns previously about the licence fee as a funding mechanism. One of the questions around Channel 4 and privatisation is it felt like that policy was being driven by a culture war narrative, because there isn't a huge amount of commercial or industrial logic towards selling off Channel 4. The case that was made for it to remain in public ownership was pretty overwhelming in the consultation. So it's felt like the culture wars has been a driving force in terms of that narrative. It doesn't strike me that Liz Truss is going to be shying away from that narrative. If you listen to her, the new British Prime Minister, during the hustings, being unwilling to say whether President Macron in France is a friend or a foe of the UK, there's plenty to suggest that the culture wars narrative will continue. What I would say, and where, if you're Channel 4 looking at all of this and wondering whether the change of government might offer something of an escape, there is limited parliamentary time. And ultimately, there needs to be a decision by the government about priorities and hierarchies of issues. How important is policy A versus policy B versus policy C? And conceivably, the new culture secretary and the new government might still, on a sort of philosophical level, want to privatise Channel 4, but on a pragmatic level might decide that is not, when there's a war in Europe, at cost of, when many British people are wondering about how the hell they're going to pay their gas bill. The decision might be that it's not a significant enough. I don't think there's a huge number of votes in privatising Channel 4. So why would you do it when you're up against a whole lot of other challenges? And there is a narrative that exists where you could see the privatisation of Channel 4 sort of being kicked into the long grass purely from a pragmatic parliamentary time point of view, rather than any philosophical change of heart or sort of support for it as an organisation. There would be some people at Horseshoe Road with their fingers crossed that that's the way it plays out, that it just ceases to be as important to the new government and so therefore goes away.
Yeah. And the new culture secretary, I think she was in education. She's been in education at some points in the past. So let's just maybe hope she's a little bit more educated about how Channel 4 is funded. She
worked previously as a marketing executive for A&E Networks UK. So, she has operated in the sort of TV industry. And believe it or not, I'm just searching for this as I speak to you, Justin. She held a senior marketing role for wrestling organisation WWE for close to 4 years. So not necessarily the experiences that you would associate with a government minister necessarily. Nadine Dorries was strident in her views. She was an ideologue in terms of her take on British public service broadcasting. And I don't think the same is true about Michelle Donnellan. So we will have to see how it all pans out.
That's going to be really interesting, and as you say, the government has really got I wouldn't say a clean slate, but actually once the funeral is over and we start to look towards the weeks and months ahead, and things start to return a little bit to normal, they've got the opportunity. New Prime Minister, new cabinet. They're going to want to put forward a new agenda and almost separate themselves to some of the criticism that Boris Johnson quite rightly came in for. So actually, it's almost like a bit of a full stop, isn't it?
Look, it's a really interesting balancing act for them to strike. What I would say is, if they deviate too far away from the election manifesto from the previous government and too far away from the sort of policies of the previous government, then you start to get into a question of legitimacy and whether or not they have a mandate, and whether that would require another election. So it's really, really difficult to say. And I also think the extent to which, it feels like we've said this every month for about the last 3 or 4 years. I don't know, but these feel like completely unprecedented times, right? The challenges facing domestic governments around the world, particularly the UK government with the added complications of Brexit, the challenges facing the UK are vast. And within that, our industry, the TV industry, is a part of that, an important part of that. But not everything is perfect in our sector. And campaigning, as broadcasters done, for Channel 4 to remain in public ownership does not mean that Channel 4 shouldn't and couldn't change in some ways. But generally speaking, British TV and the British wider creative industries are in pretty decent health, all things considered. And so this is where you come back to that sense of, if the country is facing huge challenges, and if you've got a sector that is doing pretty well, thank you very much, you would potentially hope that the government would take a hands-off approach and leave the industry to get on with trying to do what it does best.
It's going to be interesting actually into next year, because we haven't even talked about the coronation. So there will be a coronation of the new king at some point. From the speculation I've seen on BBC is that it will be a number of months away, probably next summer. So again, that gives maybe the opportunity to build a positive new Britain in the eyes of the world, because actually, what we do know about royal events is that they are watched around the world, the biggest TV events globally.
Yep.
So maybe you'll see the government looking and tapping into that. And like you say about Channel 4, it's going to be about priorities as well.
Yeah.
It's about keeping people warm this winter and hopefully still supporting Ukraine. And that's a whole different thing. We could chat about Ukraine for a whole show, I'm sure. I just wanted to return before we finish to the UK and return to the BBC. And prior to the tumultuous events of the past week, BBC Chairman Richard Sharp strongly refuted the allegations made by Emily Maitlis in her Edinburgh McTaggart speech that the BBC board contained an active agent of the Conservative Party. Well, we saw it was really quite strong rebuttal. And Richard Sharp has been in post for over a year now. Do we think that we're seeing a more confident BBC emerging under Sharp? In my view, the corporation of old seemed to keep tying itself in knots over every single issue. Yeah. Do we think we're going to see a more confident BBC and emerging after this?
Potentially. I mean, what I would say is Richard Sharp is super impressive. He spoke at the Edinburgh TV Festival. He was interviewed by the actor David Harewood and was given a relatively tough time, respectfully, but relatively tough time. And the narrative that interview pursued was that he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? That he's a close links to the government, Tory party donor. He'd been brought in as chair of the BBC. He himself was the active Tory agent operating inside the BBC and was going to sort of dismantle it from the inside. And he absolutely refuted and rejected that. He spoke about how his preconceptions of the BBC had been wrong and how he changed his views about it since joining the corporation. And he absolutely spoke passionately, defending the BBC as well. He is a businessman and he's a doer. And Tim Davie, he hasn't cut the usual background of a director jump. His, if you think about Tony Hall was used to run the Opera House. He was a newsman, but a man of the arts as well. Tim Davie's not that. He's a doer. He's a businessman. Him and Sharp share characteristics in those ways. They're trying to get on the front foot. They rejected Emily Maitlis's criticism, and ultimately a lot of these things come down to judgment calls. She gave this introduction to a Newsnight episode, and the BBC assessed it, and they felt that it had gone too far, and it sort of broached its editorial standards. It's not a great surprise that Emily Maitlis has a different view and thinks that judgment ultimately was wrong, and that the BBC is sort of sticking behind it. But you do have a situation, I think the BBC is more confident, and I would say Tim Davie's political background is well known. He's stood to be a Tory councillor in West London previously. Richard Sharp's links to the Tory party. In some ways, I actually think that if you've got a hostile government, a hostile blue government, Tory government, if Richard Sharp can't whisper in their ear and speak their language and convince them of the value of the BBC, then no one can, because he speaks their language. He's on their level. At this interview up at Edinburgh, he said when he was made chairman of the BBC that Boris Johnson said to him, and it had slightly faint echoes of Trump, to be honest, in a slightly weird way, but he said, make the BBC great again, was Boris's message to Richard Sharp. And what I took from that was not necessarily the significance of Boris's message, but the fact that Richard Sharp said that as though chatting to the PM was simply something that you do as a matter of course. So I think it helps the BBC to have people that are connected to the government and well informed. And I do think, we're going to have a debate about the future licence fee. We were talking about it earlier. The best thing the BBC can do is get out on the front foot and start making the case, but not defensively. The BBC should make the case for the retention of the licence fee if it believes that's the right thing to do. But it should also proactively join the debate about what are the other options for funding the BBC. And the BBC should be making a case for how can we have a well-funded BBC through alternative means. What are the different funding mechanisms that would pave the way for a well-funded BBC that, operates in the size and shape that it believes is correct for the role that it plays in British society? I think I'm giving you a very long and rambling answer, which is yes. Do I think the BBC is feeling a bit more confident about itself? Yes, I do. How well that works, how effective they are in this lobbying that's going to take place over the coming months and years, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, I think, bringing us full circle, then the coverage that we're going to see, particularly around next Monday, it's never been so important for the BBC to get it right. That's definitely, I think, going to help, particularly in the nation's mind, I think, when we're talking about these issues in the BBC. And I think people, will be reminded of the value of it, hopefully.
This is the size of the prize, right? There's going to be a television event on Monday, the 19th of September, the likes of which I don't think we'll have seen before. That doesn't mean I think it's going to be the highest rated thing ever. Who knows? But it's impossible to overstate the significance of that. And the BBC is going to be at the heart. It's going to be the main platform by which the majority of the British public interact with and view and consume the funeral of the Queen. And the opportunity there is vast. Do a great job and cement the place of the BBC in British culture and British society. That's where the corporation finds itself with, as we record this today, 6 days away. The opportunity is there for it to absolutely reaffirm its place in Britain. And irrespective of my views about the monarchy or whatever it might be, I think that, I wish the BBC well in its endeavours to produce amazing coverage of that funeral and achieve what we've just been talking about, that it does restate how important it is to this country.
And I'm sure we're going to see BBC's pictures beamed all around the world as well, not only on BBC World, but perhaps other networks as well over the next few days. Chris, thank you for spending time with us.
A pleasure.
Really interesting chatting with you about all of these issues. Obviously, even the Channel 4 issue, we could speak about that for a whole show, and the BBC and probably pretty much everything else. So
yeah, and you know what? Time will pass and we'll get back to talking about finished tape deals and format acquisitions and shows being commissioned and execs moving jobs, and the world keeps moving. But for now, we are, like I said before, in this weird holding pattern, and then we'll see over the coming days how the industry gradually emerges from it.
and if you did have a show launching this week, well, good luck to you, and fingers crossed in relaunching it whenever it gets rescheduled. Chris, thanks a lot. All the best to you and the guys at Broadcast, and we'll speak to you very soon.
Thanks, Justin.
Well, that's about it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it with friends and colleagues. Don't forget to visit TellyCast.com, where we have exclusive features and information about all of our upcoming events. TellyCast is edited by Ian Chambers and was recorded in London. Until next week, stay safe